All right, everybody, forget about e-readers. How about 13 actual books in one hand? Today, I want to talk to you guys about tiny books of theology and spirituality. And I've got quite a few on my shelf, and I wanted to share a few of my favorites with you all and talk about them. And I'll kind of hold them up and talk about them as I go. But sometimes you just want a little book of theology or a substantial little book. You know, you might also read some of those very short introductions that Oxford puts out on other subjects, science, history, and philosophy, and so on. But sometimes it's nice to have something you can just stuff in a coat pocket. Because it's little, you can stuff it in a purse. You could even, if you have a paper calendar like I still have, you could cram it up in your calendar and just have it with you. And so those moments when you find yourself, you know, waiting in line at the DMV or the post office or whatever it is, instead of just pulling out your smartphone and rather mindlessly scrolling through social media or looking for the latest rage bait on the news websites, you could actually be reading something that's good for your soul and good for your mind. And so I want to talk about some tiny books of theology and spirituality that I think would be good for you. And the first 3 or 4 I'm going to talk about are all in the Upper Room Spiritual Classics. The Upper Room is a ministry of the United Methodist Church. I think it's one of the best general church ministries we have going on. And they have published these spiritual classics, and they're all very small. This is, I think, the first edition. I think they all look different now. But the first one I want to mention is this one, Longing for Holiness, Selected Writings by John Wesley. And I've talked about these Upper Room spiritual classics before. They have short sections. This one is taken from John Wesley's writings, obviously, so from his journals. You see these are quite short, just 2-3 pages. This one's from The Character of a Methodist, which was kind of a treatise he put out. There's a quote here about giving and generosity from his sermon, The Use of Money. So drawing from across his writings. Here's advice about pride from A Plain Account of Christian Perfection, one of Wesley's most influential and famous documents, kind of a short book or long treatise. So the Upper Room Spiritual Classics, obviously, if you're like me and you're a Wesleyan, you want to get the writings of John Wesley and be able to kind of carry some of that around with you. They've also got, if you want to look into the early church fathers, here's Hungering for God, selected writings from St. Augustine of Hippo. And this is kind of a highlight reel from his Confessions. And so you kind of read some of those really famous chapters or sections of his famous Confessions, one of the most influential works of Christian theology anywhere. And so you can learn more about Augustine by reading from his spiritual autobiography, but reading a very, very, very abridged version, very short, that you can carry around with you. Now, in the Eastern churches, there is a collection, an anthology of writings from the Desert Fathers, called the Philokalia, and very much in that spirit, the Upper Room Spiritual Classics put this one out, Seeking a Purer Christian Life, the Desert Mothers and Fathers. And again, it's just little sayings from different monks and nuns, and again, short little sections. I like short little sections. One of the virtues of these little books, if you're anything like me, I can get bogged down reading these huge books, sometimes multi-volume works I've been doing lately of biography or systematic theology, and sometimes you want to just pick something up that you can actually finish and feel like I actually finished and started and finished a book. The Soul's Delight by the British writer Evelyn Underhill. I don't know so much about Evelyn Underhill. I know she was a British writer, and I think she's kind of early 20th century Anglo-Catholic. Somebody who knows more can correct me in the comments, but got the Upper Room Spiritual Classics put out a volume of her writings. And then if you want to look at one of the great medieval saints, or 2 of them actually, they have The Riches of Simplicity, select writings of St. Francis and Clare. And I live in a town called St. Francisville, and so, you know, he's kind of the patron saint around here. So if you've never read anything of St. Francis, this would be something easy to pick up and to read. I do remember this in particular. There's a paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer where he kind of talks about the meaning of the prayer. So if that's a prayer you say every day, this might help you kind of appreciate what you're doing a little more deeply. Another short book, this is one I read in college that definitely made an impression on me, is Experiencing God Through Prayer by Madame Gayon. Madame Gayon was a French mystic, and she actually was accused of heresy by the Roman Catholic authorities and spent some time in prison. But she had a very difficult and at times unhappy life, and she sought solace, as we all should do in those times, in God through prayer. And she actually began to have mystical experiences and really had some great insights on the life of prayer. And again, this is a short little book. I think it's Whitaker House Press. Yeah, they do some of these spiritual books. Madame Gayon and the next guy I'm going to mention, Francois Fenelon, though both of them are Roman Catholics, they both were very influential on John Wesley. He read both of these, and not these particular books, but these writers, and was much impressed by them, and they affected his understanding of our relationship with God. So that's kind of relevant to our Wesleyan heritage as well. For those of you guys who are Wesleyans, this is the only one in this stack that I've not read in or read at all. This one is by Francois Finnelan, and I'm really interested in reading it. And maybe we'll do this as a Sunday school class or something. It's very short little letters. They're all like 1 or 2 pages. So we could maybe do several in a week and do it as a group study. But Francois Finnelan was a French archbishop in the Church of Rome, and he actually defended Madame Gayon. They knew each other, and when Madame Gayon was being charged with heresy, Fenelon actually was one who respected her and defended her. And he also, as I said, was made an impact on the thinking of John Wesley. And I've heard other Protestant thinkers who really admire Fenelon and speak very highly of him. He's much admired by Gary Thomas, who's a Baptist spiritual writer. He wrote Sacred Marriage. Gary Thomas, yeah, I think that's right. And that's a book I really like, Sacred Marriage. So I'm looking forward to reading this one. Very short, probably could sit and read it, in just an afternoon if I just went straight through it. But all of these are really books you probably want to savor a little bit, even though they're short. Here's a super important classic, The Practice of the Presence of God. Again, this one is published by Whitaker House. And these are writings of and about Brother Lawrence. And the practice of the presence of God is, in a way, it's a very simple idea, which is everything you do, whether you're washing dishes or a young parent, you might say changing diapers, or doing your work at your office or wherever you work. Everything you do can be offered to God as a kind of act of worship and prayer, and everything you do can be kind of a place of meeting God. And I think that there's a famous quote from Martin Luther who said something along the lines of, we can worship God even while drinking a beer, to his friend and colleague Philip Melanchthon. And that's very much what this book is sort of about. So this book has been very influential. Again, many Protestant and evangelical writers will really highlight Brother Lawrence. Here's a short N.T. Wright book. We're getting into a little more theology now. This is called The Challenge of Easter. Tom Wright has been very big on, or N.T. Wright as he's known, and this is from InterVarsity Press. He's been very big on recovering the importance of the resurrection in the Christian life, and not only the resurrection of Jesus, but our own resurrection, which we affirm every week in the creeds of the church, that we believe in them, but they often don't really seem to be very relevant to our spiritual life and our understanding of God and his purposes. So he talks about that a lot. And so this is kind of a defense of why we believe in the resurrection of Jesus and what that means for us as Christians. The Challenge of Easter by N.T. Wright by InterVarsity Press. So that's another little short one. Maybe as we get into the Easter season, you might want to read that. And here's a book of Wesleyan Theology. This is by Lovett Weems, who was president of St. Paul School of Theology as a Methodist theologian. This is a pretty simple introduction to John Wesley's theology, his understanding of sin and grace, and how salvation works in our lives and what the holy life looks like. And it's a short little book. It has questions for reflection and at the end of each section. And it's just a great little introduction to Wesleyan theology. What do we mean when we talk about being saved, and what does that look like? This is a great little, the pocket guide, great little introduction to John Wesley's message. A couple little books here about dealing with suffering and trouble. This might fit with Fenelon's book over there. The Will of God by Leslie Weatherhead. This is an interesting book because we often struggle with, and I've taken some of the ideas from this book and made it into a sermon series years ago, and I've preached it in a couple of different churches. But we talk about, something crazy happens, something bad happens, and we say, is this God's will? And what Weatherhead points out is that what we mean by the will of God may not be as simple as you think. So he talks about God's intentional will, God's circumstantial will, like given these circumstances, this is what God wills, even though these circumstances themselves are not necessarily what God wanted, but the result of our sin. He talks about God's ultimate will for us and for creation, and discerning the will of God. So he kind of, we sometimes hear cliches like everything happens for a reason, or, God's in charge of everything. And sometimes those cliches, though they have some truth in them, they can also be misleading. And he kind of digs into some of that. And I think this is a very helpful book if you're struggling on an intellectual level, maybe during times of tragedy or who knows what, pandemic, about the will of God. So this is a good little book. I like it. I recommend it. I know some people have criticized Weatherhead. And this is another little one about dealing with struggles and adversity, walking in valleys of darkness, a Benedictine journey through troubled times. And this is probably less well-known than all these others, by Albert Holtz, who's a Benedictine monk. And this is kind of, if you're into like biblical word studies, this is sort of what he's a Bible scholar. You see, here's a chapter on cancer. And in every one of these chapters, he looks at a particular word in Greek or Hebrew and how it's used in Scripture, and how that word actually can learning to let go through his knee surgery. How that word actually spoke to him at a particular time when he was struggling with, as you see, illnesses, hardships. He talks about struggling with failures of different enterprises that he was a part of that didn't work out right or the way he wanted. And so, and as he was like struggling through that, here's like a particular Greek word from the Bible or phrase that helped him. So it's very Bible focused, and it's one that I really like. My wife and I read this together a few years ago. And then final one I want to mention today is The Lord's Supper by Thomas Watson. The original title of this was The Holy Eucharist by Watson. It was originally published in the 1600s, in the 17th century. 1665, yeah. Watson was a Puritan writer in the 17th century, and that means he's a Calvinist. And you might say, well, what's this Methodist, preacher doing reading a Calvinist? Well, on the Lord's Supper and sacramental theology in general, but especially on the Eucharist, Wesleyan theology and Reformed or Calvinist theology are actually pretty close. There's a great deal of overlap. And so this is, and Wesley was actually influenced by certain spiritual writers among the Puritans, so he was not necessarily anti-Puritan. So Thomas Watson is, I think, if you're a Wesleyan or a Methodist, this is not, this is not a bad book to read, and it's very interesting. He has a lot of quotes from early church fathers and medieval writers, as well as from other Reformed Protestant writers. And so even on the title page, there's a quote from St. Bernard of Clairvaux. In the original title page, it was in Latin, and they give us the English translation. Christ gave us his flesh for food, his blood for drink, his soul as our price, the water from his side for our cleansing, said St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And this Puritan, you might be surprised at how high his theology of the Lord's Supper is. He thought that was a good quote from Bernard to include on his title page. So he talks about preparing yourself for communion. He talks about what's going on in communion and some of the ways it nourishes our soul. And so I have really enjoyed this little book, and I do recommend it if you're looking for a meditation on the Lord's Supper. I might do another video just on meditations on the sacraments, to how you can maybe get more out of your experience of the sacraments through reading certain books or certain sermons or things like that. Anyway, this is just a few of the books on my shelf that are tiny books of theology and spirituality. Like I said, you could get 13 books in one hand, and that's pretty cool. So maybe some of those will be something you're interested in checking out. Maybe you've got some other recommendations of tiny books that you'd like to share that maybe some of the viewers of this channel would also profit from. So until we connect again, I pray that you will keep learning and growing and getting to know the heart of God more deeply. Amen.